Welcome, one and all, to the very first episode of World Building with Manki. Glad you all could be here. So, as some of you know who may have watched my YouTube before or seen anything about me on Twitch, you know that I run a lot of RPGs. I run a lot of tabletop RPGs, Dungeons & Dragons, Stars Without Number, Fantasy Flight role-playing, or Fantasy Flight games, Star Wars RPG, among many other list of one-shots. I am a perma-DM, which means basically I am always the one in charge of actually running said games. So what that means a lot in the grand scheme of things is I tend to spend a lot of time, an inordinate amount of time, one would say, learning how to build a world and building a world. So I'd like to consider myself at least a minor, perhaps a semi-professional world builder. And we're going to turn the audio down here just a wee bit. So I like to consider myself kind of a semi-professional world builder. And so what this series is going to aim to do is going to be to build a world within Divinity. Now, Divinity itself is very rich and very lush and very beautiful, with a lot of interlaced stories and lore within its function. This is not an aim to build another Divinity. What this is meant to do is meant to design our own world using the constraints of the video game Divinity Original Sin 2. Now, for those of you who may be questioning why using a video game to do that and how we're going to do that, well, we're going to get into it. First of all, I'm going to learn myself a little bit. But as you can see, Divinity Original Sin 2 is one of a couple of games that have come out in the recent past that has what we call a Game Master mode, which is essentially a mode in which it is possible for a person like me who runs games, tabletop games. Now, granted, I run them via a service called Roll20. But someone like me who runs tabletop games to create our own scenarios and our own worlds and our own games within the constraints of the video game itself. I have seen some of this completed before. Obviously pre-generated written adventures and stuff like that. Our goal is to make an adventure that we will hopefully eventually make public to the group, or to the wide world of the internet. And the goal, if we're going to set out some goals, which it's probably important to understand, since this is going to be a more idealistic focused kind of show, probably important to do something like this. There we go. Now you all can see my monitor. Hopefully that doesn't affect the game in any way. We'll see. So we're going to pull out our notepad here, and we're going to be interlacing in between music because you can't play the Divinity music in the background. No, I just want this. So, the first thing, whenever you build an adventure like this, is going to be goals. What do we want the goals of this particular project to be? And let me just... So, the goals of this particular project, I think it is it's probably important. Make this font a little bit bigger. Goals. So, the first goal of this project is going to be, we want to create a playable adventure. Right? That's going to be the overall goal of what we want to do. I think 48's a little big. Let's make it 28. Create a playable adventure. That's going to be our first goal, right? The first goal that we're going to do. So this, in and of itself, has a set of sub-goals. And these sub-goals include things like we need a setting. And we need a purpose. and we need a set of probably we would call these a set of scenes, right? What we would do, a set of scenes, or probably better, a set of steps to be taken. So playable adventures are one of a couple things. I'm sure a lot of you have seen many playable adventures, and again, I stress to the point that we're not designing an entire video game, right? What we're actually designing is simply a small, short adventure. We want to start small and perhaps grow it bigger after that. In the format that we have here, it is probably better to have a series of scenarios that are somehow linked using perhaps the same characters, the same setting, the same NPCs. And which is important to note too. If we're going to have a setting, we also need that setting to have NPCs. We need it to have creatures. We need it to have problems. We need it to have believable authority. So when I say believable authority, what I really mean by that is we can't create an adventure where there is an authority either figure, be it good, bad, evil, good, or, good, bad, evil, holy, whatever you want to call it, whatever the believable authority is. But it's important to have believable authority in the sense that when a character or a player is not forced to do something, but when somebody is instructing them to do something, it is coming from a believable and logical source. A good example of this is if you're playing a Dungeons and Dragons game and the king of the realm asks you to partake in asks you to embark on a quest. The king himself, as a kind of, omnipotent NPC, does not have believable authority. His believable authority comes where the characters are part of this setting. The characters have either witnessed or seen or become ingrained in part of this society, and they've accepted the king. The other way is kind of the omniscient, or omniscient is not the right word, kind of the overall theme that when we think about a fantasy setting, we think about a king as being in charge of things, right? So we need to make sure that when we have a believable authority, there is a figure, or there is a perhaps a faction, or perhaps someone, something, and this could be as abstracted as the gods within our setting, right? It can be as abstracted as just the laws of nature, the laws of physics, perhaps how the laws of physics interact with each other. So a good example of this in Divinity, for those of you that have ever played the game, it plays a lot with kind of combining effects to create these different sources of damage, combining two different effects like fire and poison to create explosions, using water or steam to douse fire on your allies, using oil to spread fire, using what are some of the good examples in Divinity? Using water or blood on the ground to electrify, so that enemies that are standing within that have a chance to be stunned. So the believable authority in the game could literally be the physics that exist. So it's very important to have that thing in a setting. And it's a running theme. You'll notice with all of my games, I have believable authorities. For example, in Siege of the Empire, the believable authority is like the Empire, like the ingrained Empire in the setting. But I haven't just made it this kind of stands on a side, led my players to believe and accept it. some of the players are involved directly with it. I've created NPCs that make it that believable authority. As well, the laws of how everybody act in Warhammer Fantasy, which is where the setting is, are a little bit different than your typical fantasy setting. Magic is not revered in that setting. It is seen with great hesitancy. In Olympus, I have the Westwind Corporation, who the players started out working for. And again, they don't have to. Like, they don't have to believe in that authority. It doesn't have to be believable to them. But I've introduced NPCs. I have introduced all of these different elements to make it a believable authority. And it really adds a lot of flavor and a lot of legitimacy to the world around it. Very important that we have. In fact, it's so important, I'm just going to put asterisks around it. That's how important I personally believe having a believable authority, be it figure, be it whatever else. And the example in the Star Wars world, they don't all work for anyone in particular, but the believable authority in the Star Wars world could be considered, perhaps the Commonwealth is a good example. But another thing that it could be is it could certainly be just the Force, right? The Force could be the example of the believable authority in the Star Wars setting. It's not necessarily a faction or NPC that's going to wield it. It's kind of this more gaseous, non-tangible substance or idea within the galaxy. But it is in existence, right? And it controls people's lives, making it an authoritative figure within that world. So that's a good example of what I mean by believable. What else do we need in a setting? So as well in a setting, we need we have NPCs, we have creatures, we have problems, we have believable authority. I think that we need purpose, right? We need purpose. We need a reason why anyone would go out and adventure. Some examples of what might be good in this scenario might be things like in the first game of Divinity, you were source hunters. You were part of a source hunting order who went out and tracked down sorcerers. Great. We have a believable authority that we can dive right into. Great. Or I'm sorry, we have a purpose that we can dive right into. The purpose is we are source hunters. We are destined to put out source. So within our setting, in order to create an adventure, and I know I put it here as well as part of the setting, but I'm making parts of the setting together. But we need a reason why we need to do this. It can be as simple as there is an evil that's trying to take over the world and you have to go save it. Or it can be kind of as complicated as, you're in there's a political coup that has occurred and you've been instructed to, you've been like ordered to find out how it happened. It could be as convoluted as that because there are any number of reasons that a political coup could come about. So those are some ideas of a purpose that we're going to use here. So other things that are in a playable adventure besides the setting is going to be set of steps taken. And so I think in this I'm going to change this wording to procedures, right? And I'm going to put those in quotation marks because that's not super accurate. But what I really mean by this, what I really mean by the procedures is how do you win and how do you lose, right? Another thing to ask us here is how do we start, right? Obviously ending is winning or losing, so it's how do we start. And this should probably even go here, right? What in the hell? How do we start? Right, how do we start? How do we win? How do we lose? And that's specific to the playable adventure part. So, some other things that we need are, also, is procedure spelled incorrectly? I think it is. Great. This is why I'm not a literature major, because I don't know how to spell. Right. Okay, now it is spelled correctly. So, it's how do we start, how do we win, how do we lose, right? That's what we're looking into when we're talking about procedures. Other things in a playable adventure are going to be, obviously, the characters, right? In any playable adventure, we need the, and here I should actually specify it's going to be the player characters, right? We want the player characters to be a big part of the playable adventure. Now, we have to make it generic, and we have to make it approachable, and we have to make it inclusive, right? So there's three things about the player characters specifically that we need to consider when we're making our playable adventure. Now, in every single, or not every single, in a lot of adventures that we see, and a lot of, we call them, printed adventures in the tabletop RPG world, that we see, they are designed with the thought that the characters will be making their own, or the players will be making their own characters. And that's part of the generic part, right? Part of the generic part of being able to create your own characters, or making an adventure where players can create their own characters, is the idea that no matter what a character brings to the table, it will be able to be included here. Now, this is both a good and a bad thing, depending on what you're actually trying to approach. So when we're talking about generic, we're talking about wanting a place for all characters, no matter who they create. If the party wants to go through as, as a bunch of rogues, we need to make sure that there is space for them to do that. If the party wants to go through as a balanced party, we need to make sure there's space for that too. If the party wants to go through as a bunch of very serious, kind of take no crap from no one, then we need to make sure that we have that as well. And so that's what we mean by generic in this particular scenario when we're talking about the player characters. Now, that does not mean, in fact, this is important enough to say, does not mean all characters will be useful all the time. Okay? Does not mean that all characters will be useful all the time. Now, do we want to perhaps build it with the thought of it can be played by 1 to 4 players? Sure, maybe. Maybe we want to make an adventure that can be played solo, where all characters where a character will be able to, or will be forced to do all of the things by themselves. But that does not always mean, again, that all characters will be useful all the time. If you choose to go through the adventure as a single character, perhaps you should be weak in certain things. Which actually makes me think of, we need to, when we're talking about player characters, when we're creating a playable adventure, we need to make sure that there are weaknesses and strengths that are considered, right? We need to consider the weaknesses and strengths of the character. In fact, that's actually not going to be its own thing. I apologize. Generic does not mean that all characters will be useful all the time. Does not mean that. Whatever, whatsoever. In fact, I am of the belief, and this is a personal belief, I know that this is not everyone's belief, that a single character should not be useful in every situation. There should not be a single character who can do everything and be everything, because for those of us that play these types of games, the weaknesses of our characters that our personas that we take on, are sometimes the most interesting part of them. Good examples of this in media, right, are, I think the best example in recent media is Han Solo. We consider the character and the persona of Han Solo. It's not that he is good at flying a ship that makes him interesting. It is that he is a smuggler that is good at flying a ship, right? That's the part that makes Han Solo interesting. It's not the part that he's done the Kessel Run in under 12 parsecs. It's the part of, why has he done the Kessel Run in under 12 parsecs? Was he running from something? Did he do it on a whim? Was he perhaps smuggling something? Which brings us back to our first point. So, all characters not being useful at all times is great. Their flaws, be they physical, emotional, mental, whatever they be, are the most important, and sometimes the most interesting part about the character. Obviously, we want the characters to feel epic as well, but we'll get to that. The second thing when we're considering player characters in our adventure is we need to make the adventure approachable. Now, what I mean by approachable in this term is we need to make sure that the characters understand, not the characters. We need to make sure that the players who go to get into this adventure understand what they are getting into. It needs to be approachable for them. They need to know, hey, this is the type of adventure I'm getting into. Great. Awesome. So with that being said, when we're talking about making approachable adventures, we don't necessarily mean kid-friendly. We don't necessarily mean, that everybody's going to love it. In fact, we go under the assumption that a very few people will love it. Some people will think it's okay, and some people will not like it, and some people will hate it. That's just how it's going to happen. We understand that. We know that. But when we're talking about approachable, we need to make sure that a person who walks up to this adventure or looks at this adventure on, let's say, the Steam Workshop, they look at this adventure. We need to make sure that they understand what it is that they are looking at. That's what I mean by approach scenario. So to define this more, needs to be easily understood. But can be complex. So that's the other side of the coin with approachable. It's the concept of, if you've ever played a game or ever heard somebody say that something is easy to learn but hard to master. That is an example of an approachable item. A good example of this is poker. Right? Poker, at its base level, is very easy to understand. It is a very easy concept to say, I want the best of 5. I want the best possible hand out of 5 cards. Right? That's an easy thing to say. We have a list. Here are all of the types of hands ranked from 0 to there's 23 different types of hands or something like that. I don't know. I pulled a number out of my butt. That concept is easily understood. The game at high levels can be quite complex. It involves statistics. It involves a bit of chance. It involves, at the deeper levels, when we get into like professional poker, it involves social skills. It involves the ability to bluff. It involves the ability to detect a bluff. It involves the ability to, it involves stress management of your opponents. If you're an individual who's playing poker and you have a very large pile in front of you of chips, it is easier for you to manage the stress of your opponent with your chips. For someone who has the smaller stack of chips, they have to manage the stress level of their opponents by their body language, by their posture, by the way that they're playing, by their calls. And I think that if you spoke with any professional poker players, they would say that they probably know the people that sit at their tables far better than they know their friends or their spouses or their kids, because in the space of a few hours of gameplay, you have to learn almost everything there is about that person sitting across from you. So that's a very like complex idea to think about when we're playing poker. However, poker itself at its base level is a very easily understood, approachable game. So, when we say approachable in this context, we want something like poker. We want something that somebody can pick up and literally just talk to very few people, kill a bunch of things, get the epic loot, and enjoy themselves and have a great time with their friends. But we also want, for the people who want to read all of the dialogue, who want to get into the story, who want to experience all of these new emotions that are going to bubble up from the NPCs and the fights and, you know, their friends' tension levels throughout the game. We want that complexity to be there as well. Very much like base game Divinity does. I mean, during our 24-hour stream that we did, which you can also find here on YouTube, or you can look in the VODs on Twitch if you're watching this live. During our 24-hour stream, there were a couple of very key moments where this happened, where there was complex emotional turmoil within the game due to the text and what was going on inside of it, right? The most notable one for me was the witch, who I don't even remember her name. It was traumatic enough that I've just forgotten her name. But it was the witch where the blood roses grew, all the corpses. And the text, if I were the player who just wanted to get through the dialogue and punch everybody in the face and kill everybody, I would have gotten through that, and it was a great fight. It was a tremendous fight. She summoned all these ads, she teleported to the high ground. I had to chase her down while my co-op partner Megan was fighting off these bugs, and like there's status effects and we're all diseased, and it was a really, really epic fight in like kind of this tight, confined cave area, right? So it was like super, super cool fight-wise. But I was emotionally invested in the fight because just prior to that, during the dialogue scenes, she vomited bugs down my mouth. That's a really, like, visceral thing to have happen to a character that I had up to that point played for 23 hours straight, right? It's a very visceral thing, and I was emotionally distraught about that. So that fight meant even more to me because there was a complex emotional reaction that I had to the very easily understood fight that was going on. So I brought it all back there. Am I wonderful? So that's what we want by approachable. We want the game to be easy to understand, not necessarily hard to master. We don't need to necessarily make it super hard, but we want it to be easily understandable, but complex for those that want to invest the time in. Awesome. So we see this word inclusive here. Now, the word inclusive means a lot of things, in particular in today's society, but the inclusive that I am using in this particular context is we want to make it so that anyone who wants to can play this. Now, you might say, well, you know, isn't that what you want by generic? Isn't that what by approachable? Like, if something's approachable, everybody wants to play it. No. It's not what we're talking about here. Remember, our overall theme for these three options is player characters, right? So as far as inclusive, what we want in this scenario is we want a broad range of options. Broad options, right? We want a broad range of options for any and all characters. So what I mean by that is, by a broad range of options, Divinity does this, base game Divinity does this very, very well. I can simply hold down the control button and click on someone and I will attack them. I can do it to any NPC in the world. I can do it to literally every single person in the entire world of Divinity. That's amazing. That adds a set of options that would not be available in most video games. But that is the sort of freedom that tabletop RPGs give to us. But as well, when we're talking about inclusiveness, when referring to player characters, when we talked about generic, we want I mentioned briefly that, you know, if the party wants to play as a bunch of rogues, that's totally fine. If the party wants to play as a bunch of, you know, frivolous wizards, that's totally fine. If the party wants to play as a bunch of, you know, meat grinder fighters, that's totally fine as well. Or if they want to have some sort of balanced party, that's totally fine as well. The inclusiveness part, and the reason why it is separate from this, means that while all characters don't necessarily need to be useful at all the time, they should all be included in the story, right? So just because all characters are not going to be useful all the time, we want to have enough things within our world, within our adventure, that any character someone makes is included at some point in the story, right? So that party of rogues, we want there to be a sneaking element. Maybe we want there to be a reward for sneaking in somewhere. Maybe we want there to be a reward for pickpocketing somewhere. Maybe we want there to be a reward for having a high persuasion somewhere. Great. Cool. It's going to be one element to our story that is inclusive to that player character, that type of player character. There'll be other ways to solve it, obviously. You could just kill them and take their things. But that's one way to be inclusive with our choices. Another thing is, we might have an element where it's a fighting gauntlet, and perhaps it is particularly well designed for like one person to kind of stand in the doorway and tank a whole bunch of guys that are flying down and around, right? That would be really good for our meat grinder fighters. That would be really good for our tank, our shield, our sword, and board characters. Sure, maybe you could like move a barricade in front of it and have them have to chop through the barricade to get to you. That seems great too. Maybe you could light a bunch of elements right there in front of it for a mage type character or an elementalist type character. Great, that seems good too. But we wanted to reward that meat grindery character a little bit. Doesn't need to be the whole adventure. We just need to be inclusive with certain elements of our adventure to make sure that we are covering and including all of the different archetypes of characters that can exist. So that's what I mean by inclusive when we're talking about player characters, right? Doesn't mean anything else. That's all it means. Broad options for any and all characters. Very simply put. So, these are some things that we need. The last one that I'm going to put here, which some might say is the most important, is we need a story, right? We need a story to tell. We need there to be some element that we want to tell. Now, this is very similar to setting. In fact, I've had purpose up here, but I'm actually going to erase purpose. Because the story includes the purpose. Why is this a story worth telling? What element of this adventure is going to be worth telling? This is what our purpose is going to be. Some other things that we need to remember about a story is how can it change? Okay. So this is a question we ask ourselves when we're building a story, in particular with tabletop RPGs. Now, a lot more RPG creators nowadays do this, where they talk about how their stories can change. I think really the pioneers, or pioneers is a good word for it. Maybe the pioneers and most truest example of how can a story change are the BioWare games, right? I am a huge BioWare fanboy. I love all of their games, even the ones that are not critically acclaimed. I love I love multiple parts about every single game they've ever created, all the way back from Baldur's Gate, Neverwinter Nights, all the way up to Mass Effect Andromeda, which I think was one of the best RPGs that has come out in recent times. Story-based RPGs, put it that way. So a lot of things about what BioWare does are, and this is not a slight against them, this is just a smart way to tell your story is changing things but not really, right? So in probably my favorite BioWare game is Dragon Age Origins. And in Dragon Age Origins, spoiler alert, if you've never played the game from 2009, by the way, in case you're watching this in the future, it is currently 2017. If you've never played Dragon Age Origins, spoilers from 2009, there is a decision at the end of the game in which you have to decide whether or not to sacrifice yourself to kill the end boss, to sacrifice a party member to kill the end boss, or to perform a ritual where neither of you dies. But it is easily understood that it is very, very, like, dark magic, right? And those are kind of, like, the three choices you have. Now, what I mean when I say that BioWare is kind of the king of changing things but not changing things, in all three of those scenarios, you still kill the beast, right? The end result is always the same for the archdemon. Death. Always the same for the archdemon. However, what does change is the player characters after that event, right? If you sacrifice yourself, you're never seen again, and they mourn your loss and enshrine you in history as the greatest Grey Warden to ever live. Which they would do anyway, because I really am the greatest Grey Warden to ever live, ever. But it's either that, or your party member, Alistair, dies, and you enshrine him as the greatest Grey Warden, second greatest Grey Warden to ever live, right? Or this Dark Mage, Morrigan, takes your archdemon child and leaves and never returns. And neither of you die. You're both still alive. So there's a lot of interesting elements that we have there. But again, the archdemon still dies. Now, in tabletop RPGs, we have the unique ability, because a human brain is always, and probably will always for the next 100 years, be able to operate on a different level than a computer, than coding, than a static story, right? So when I talk about our story, and when I say how we can change, we need to remember that we're dealing with a human brain. There will be somebody physically running this game for their players. There will be a GM who knows how the story ends and may or may not be able to edit that on the fly. So what we need to do with our story is we need to give him options. We need to try and consider, now granted, we will never, and if anyone who's ever run tabletop RPGs before will understand this, we need to consider as many available options as possible. We'll never be able to consider them all, but we need to consider as many as we can. Okay? So, with that being said, how can it change? We need to have options for the GM. This is what I mean by how can it change. We need to have options for the GM. So this is a very specific thing that we're doing as part of our story in order to make it so that our GM understands that they're not on a linear path. They have some room to maneuver around. Now, this is also the limitation of the system that we're going to be using. Also, hello PXL. I'm on a rant. This is also a system we're going to be using because it will, by some accounts, need to be linear, right? By some accounts, we need to at least set up a story that has a clear beginning and a clear ending. Because otherwise, we will leave whoever is attempting to GM this setting, this adventure, this scenario, we will leave them kind of in the dark about how they are to proceed with this particular story, right? We don't want the GM to get to a point. Granted, it will happen, but we want to give them as much leeway as possible to guide their party back on track, right? And get them to the clear ending that we will be setting up. Granted, we don't know what that is yet. We have no idea. I'm going to talk about inspiration at probably another part within this series, and where I personally draw my inspiration for designing adventures and designing worlds. But right now, we're just going to talk about this. How can it change? So other items for the story list are, besides purpose and how can it change, I think that it is important, perhaps, to move this. As you can tell, we're doing this all on the fly, but here we go. So as part of our story, three things that we need are: how do we start, how do we win, how do we lose? And PXL in chat says maybe you can add some zombie stories. So that's a great idea, right? That's part of the inspiration thing that I was talking about. So the inspiration thing that I'm talking about here is we haven't decided on what story we're going to play, right? Now Divinity does have, and I'll briefly go over back over the player characters and what we're considering for them, is Divinity 2 has the option to play as an undead character. So a zombie story might be very cool in the sense that we could literally be undead ourselves, and that would create a lot of emotional things. It would also tag our inclusive box, right? It would also tag our inclusive box to have something like, if player characters have decided that they want to play undead characters, maybe they have a different opportunity to interact with the zombies as opposed to the aforementioned meat grinder fighter who will just kill them all, right? So I think that that's a great idea that PXL has. Maybe we create a zombie element within our story as part of our inclusiveness about all of our characters, and that's great. That's fantastic. But when we're talking specifically about story, what we're talking here is what's the overall thing. Now, this is the hardest thing to do in a tabletop RPG game. The absolute 100% hardest thing to do as a GM in a tabletop RPG game is, and I'm saying this as a static, this is it. Create an overarching story that all of your players will be invested in. It is almost impossible. Almost impossible to create an overarching story that all of your players will be invested in. So what you need to do, and what I like to think, at least with all of my other games that I do very well, is instead of creating an overarching story that all of the players are invested in, I create an overarching story, and if the players are not invested in that story, what I will do is I will add other elements, other small parts of that story to either invest them in it or to make them feel included in what's happening in the moment. In Siege of the Empire right now, again, which you can find either on my YouTube channel or here on the Twitch VODs, in Siege of the Empire, they are currently fighting to reclaim a city for the Empire that was taken over by this Anders character. Not all of them have investment in that particular story. For example, Kree, the Lizardman, doesn't care about a human city. He doesn't care about that. So what I've done to invest his character in the story is I've used his deity to kind of influence him a little bit. I've used the ability to have these Lizardman units within this army that he can kind of integrate himself in. And I've invested him in the story specifically through other elements that don't really matter in the grand scheme of the overarching story, right? The overarching story is a very simple thing. So I think that the next bullet point here is overarching. Oh, we'll say arching. overarching story is simple yet broad, right? So the overarching story has to be simple yet broad. And, or hold on, simple yet open. That's a better word for it. So when I say simple yet open, what I mean by that is when we create our overarching story, it needs to be pretty simple. It needs to be something like, the city has been taken over by demons. You're trying to take the city back. Boom. That's the story. That's all we need to know about the overarching story. That's it. We don't need to know anything else. That's the only thing we need to know about the overarching story. That is a good example of a simple yet open overarching story. Cool. Awesome. Makes sense. So great. We need something like that. That's something we need as part of our story. Obviously, in these bullet points as well, I have how do we start, how do we win, how do we lose, right? And I think that even I keep moving these around, but I think that the best place to put these is actually going to be here, right? This is the best place to put them. So as part of our overarching story, we need to know how we start, how we win, how we lose. That's it. Simple 3 questions we can ask ourselves about our overarching story to know if it is important. PXL Soren says in chat, yes, 1 sentence to resume a pitch. Absolutely. It is the epitome of the elevator pitch. If you've ever heard what an elevator pitch, or ever heard somebody say, "Give me your elevator pitch," it is derived from the term of, you're in an elevator with somebody who's very, very important, right? Let's say all of us are in the elevator with Sven Vick from Larian Studios, who's the creative director of Divinity, right? You're in an elevator with him, and you say, "Hey, Sven, I have a great idea for a game." And he goes, "Okay, I have 4 floors until I am at my floor. Explain to me the entire thing." Right? That is what an elevator pitch is. It's also a great way to explain our overarching story. If it can't be explained in a couple of sentences, it's too big. It's too big, it's too much. We don't need to do it. We need simple yet open. Okay? Great. Another good example, if you don't watch Siege of the Empire, of an overarching story that's simple yet open, is Star Wars, right? Everybody knows what Star Wars is. Everybody knows, and I'm talking about the original trilogy here, right? So everybody knows that there is a farm boy who has some special power that nobody else has anymore, because everybody else is wiped out. And he's destined to save the galaxy from this very evil person, or these very evil couple of people, who are controlling it with this massive fleet. And they have to stop them by blowing up all of their ships and killing them. That's it. That's the overarching story to the entire Star Wars movies, right? The entire original trilogy. It is simple farm boy has to use this power that he has and no one else does, except for a very select few people, to stop the Empire from controlling all of its and subjugating all of its subjects by blowing up all their stuff and killing them. That's it. Notice, we have a start. The start is simple farm boy who has powers, right? That's the start of the story. How do we win? We blow up all their stuff and kill all their bad guys. Great. That's how we win. How do we lose? We die, or we don't blow up their stuff, or we don't kill them. Great. Simple, overarching story, yet very open, because the couple of sentences I just gave you do not encompass anything involved in what actually happens in Star Wars, right? But it gives you a good idea of what to expect in the Star Wars series. Great. Absolutely. Kill everyone equals win. So, we're sitting right here at about 45-50 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and take a quick break right now. I'm going to get a drink of water because I've been talking a lot, and when we come back, I'm going to click on the Game Master Mode button, and we're going to go into the actual what we do when we're going to build some things. I'm going to talk a little bit about inspiration. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're going to start building all of the things that we talked about here. Awesome. Stay tuned. We'll be back in just a few minutes.